She said it quietly, the way people do when they want maximum damage with minimum witnesses. You really should have sat at the kids' table, sweetheart. At least there. Nobody would notice what you're wearing. My cousin Vanessa didn't even look at me when she said it. She was adjusting the pearl necklace at her throat, eyes scanning the room for someone more important to talk to. The dining room of the Hargrove estate was full of exactly the kind of people who laughed at jokes like that. Old money, press suits, women in dresses that cost more than my monthly rent, and every single one of them heard her. Some smiled. None objected. I didn't reach for my wine glass. I didn't smooth my skirt. I looked at the grandfather clock against the far wall. It was 7:14 p.m. I gave them until 7:30. Before I tell you what happened at 7:30, drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I want to see how far this story reaches. I had driven 4 hours to be here. I want you to understand that first. 4 hours on a Tuesday evening, in a car with a cracked dashboard and an air conditioning unit that worked only when it felt like it, because my aunt had called me personally. The family hasn't been together in 2 years, Maya. Your uncle would have wanted this. My Uncle Harold had passed 7 months ago. This dinner was the reading of the secondary estate documents, not the will itself that had already been handled, but the property assessments, the business valuations, the paperwork that determined what got sold, what got kept, and who signed off on what. I came because she asked. I always came when they asked. I wore a navy dress I'd bought 3 years ago. It still fit. It was clean and pressed and perfectly appropriate for a family dinner. Vanessa was wearing something white and structured that probably had a designer name I'd recognize if she'd bothered to say it. She hadn't. She didn't need to. The pearl necklace said enough. Vanessa is 31. She went to Georgetown. She married a man named Carter who works in finance and says, actually, at the beginning of most sentences, she has a house in Connecticut with a mudroom. She has always, for as long as I can remember, treated me like a problem that the family hadn't gotten around to solving yet. When we were teenagers, it was about grades. She had a 4.0. I had a 3.7 and a part-time job at a hardware store, because someone in our family needed to help keep the lights on. But that detail never made it into Vanessa's version of events. When we were in our 20s, it was about careers. She was climbing at a consulting firm. I was, in her words, doing something vague with properties. She said it like that every time. Something vague with properties. Like I collected rocks. I had let it go. Every single time I had let it go. Not because I was weak. Not because I didn't notice. I let it go because I understood something about Vanessa that she had never understood about herself. She needed me to be small. It was load-bearing architecture for her. The moment I stopped being the cautionary tale, her whole self-image had a structural problem. So I stayed quiet. I drove the cracked dashboard car. I wore the 3-year-old dress. I let her have the joke about the kids' table, and I watched the room laugh, and I looked at the grandfather clock, and I counted. Here's what nobody in that dining room knew about me. I don't do something vague with properties. I run a private real estate acquisition firm. We specialize in what the industry calls distressed commercial assets, buildings in financial trouble, companies whose physical holdings are bleeding money, estates with liens and debt and complicated ownership structures that most investors won't touch because the paperwork alone takes months to untangle. I have been doing this since I was 26 years old. I am 32 now. In 6 years, I've been quiet and methodical, and I have never once posted about it on social media, never mentioned it at family dinners, never corrected Vanessa's something vague with properties, because the less they knew, the simpler my life stayed. My family has a particular relationship with money. They respect the appearance of it enormously. They are considerably less interested in the reality of it. My Uncle Harold had been the exception. He understood balance sheets. He understood that the Hargrove estate, this house, the 3 commercial properties attached to the family trust, the land holdings in 2 counties, was not in the shape the family believed it to be in. He had known for years. And 2 years before he died, he had done something about it. He had called me. I still remember sitting in my office at 7 a.m, coffee going cold on my desk, listening to my Uncle Harold explain that the trust was carrying $2.3 million in deferred debt, that 2 of the 3 commercial properties were bleeding cash, that the estate itself had a lien on it that my aunt didn't know existed, and that he needed someone who understood distressed assets to help him restructure before it became a crisis. Why me? I asked. Not fishing for a compliment. Genuinely asking, because you're the only one in this family, he said, whoever learned that money is a tool, not a costume. We worked together quietly for 18 months. I restructured the debt. I sold the worst of the commercial properties at a number that surprised his attorneys. I renegotiated the terms on the remaining two. I found a buyer for the lien and bought it back at a discount under my own holding company, which meant the estate now owed its debt to me, not to a bank that would have foreclosed without sentiment. When Harold died, his primary will distributed personal assets to my aunt and his children, including Vanessa. That had all been settled. Would have not been widely understood. Because Harold had believed in privacy the same way I did, was what the secondary documents said, the ones being reviewed tonight, the ones that governed the trust. I had not told anyone I was coming tonight as anything other than family. I sat at the end of the table, in the seat closest to the kitchen, and I watched Vanessa hold court. She was talking about the Connecticut house, the renovation they'd done on the kitchen, the countertops that had taken 14 weeks to source from Italy. Carter nodded beside her with the expression of a man who had stopped listening sometime around the 14-week mark, but had learned to perform attentiveness convincingly. My Aunt Patricia sat at the head of the table. She is a woman who has always reminded me of a beautiful house with bad wiring, elegant on the outside, dangerous if you look too closely at the infrastructure. She had smiled when Vanessa made the kids' table joke. Not a big smile, just enough. My mother was not here. She had not been invited to this dinner, which told me everything I needed to know about how the family had been discussing tonight. This was meant to be a celebration. The estate was going to be divided among the Hargrove direct line. They had already decided, in whatever conversations had happened before I arrived, that it would be simple, that it would be theirs. The family attorney, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had the posture of someone who'd been delivering bad news for 40 years and had made peace with it, arrived at 7:20. He set his briefcase on the sideboard, accepted a glass of water, and declined the wine. He had the expression of a man who knew something the room didn't. Vanessa was still talking about countertops. Gerald cleared his throat. The room settled. My Aunt Patricia folded her hands on the table with the grace of a woman who had been anticipating this moment for 7 months. I want to thank everyone for coming, Gerald said. As you know, we're here to review the trust documentation and the secondary estate instruments that Harold left in order. Before we begin, I want to ask, he looked around the table, is everyone who needs to be here present? Of course, Vanessa said with the confidence of someone who had never once been surprised by a legal document. We're all here. Gerald looked at me. Ms. Chen? Present, I said. Vanessa's eyes moved to me. Something flickered there. A small hesitation, gone before it fully formed. She didn't understand why Gerald was confirming my presence specifically. That was fine, she would. Gerald opened his briefcase. I want to pause here and tell you something about the year I turned 28, because it matters. I was in my 2nd year of running the firm. We had exactly 3 clients, 1 small office building in Phoenix that I was restructuring, and approximately $40,000 in my business account. I was not broke, but I was close enough to smell it. My parents called me in March of that year. Not to check on me. They called because my father's business, a small logistics company he'd run for 15 years, had defaulted on a credit line. The bank was moving to seize assets. They needed $78,000 in 30 days. I had $40,000 in the business. I liquidated everything I had outside the firm. I had been saving toward a down payment on a small commercial property of my own, the first thing I was going to own purely for myself. I had been saving for 2 years. I wired it to my father without telling him where it came from, because if I told him it was my savings, he wouldn't take it, and if he didn't take it, the business would collapse and my parents would lose their house. I went back to renting a room in a shared house. I drove a car with a taped-up rear window for 18 months. I never mentioned it. Not to my parents. They thought it was a loan from a business line I had. Not to my aunt. Not to my aunt. Not to Vanessa. Not to anyone in that dining room who was about to hear what Harold had put in the trust documents. I lived small, so they could stay comfortable. I'd been doing that my whole life without once calling it what it was. Gerald began reading. The first section was standard. Inventory of the estate's physical assets, the house, the land, the remaining commercial properties. Vanessa nodded along like she was following a script she'd already memorized. Carter was on his second glass of wine. My Aunt Patricia had the controlled expression of a woman waiting for the part where she wins. Then Gerald reached section 4. With regard to the Hargrove family trust, he read, and the restructuring agreement entered into in the 3rd year prior to Mr. Hargrove's passing, the trust's debt obligations previously held by First Meridian Bank were acquired in full by Clearwater Holdings LLC in a private transaction. The room was still following. They'd heard the term restructuring and assumed it meant something favorable had happened. Rich people use the word restructuring, the way they use the word transition, as a soft landing for hard news. The trust currently owes Clearwater Holdings LLC, Gerald continued, the sum of $1.9 million, secured against the estate property and the 2 remaining commercial holdings. My Aunt Patricia's expression shifted slightly. Who is Clearwater Holdings? Gerald looked up. He looked at me. Vanessa looked at me. The whole table looked at me. I picked up my water glass. I took a sip. I set it down. That's me, I said. The silence that followed was the kind that has physical weight. You could feel it pressing on the room. I'm sorry, Vanessa said. She said it the way people say things when they've heard perfectly clearly and need a moment to decide how to react. Clearwater Holdings is my company, I said. I've held the trust's debt for the last 2 years. I worked with Harold to restructure the estate's liabilities before he passed. The terms are in the documents Gerald has. That's Vanessa stopped, restarted. That's not possible. You do something. She caught herself. You work in real estate. Yes, I said. I do. Carter said actually, and then didn't follow it with anything. My Aunt Patricia's voice was very careful when she spoke. Maya, are you saying that you hold the debt on this estate? On the trust, yes. The estate itself and both commercial properties are collateral. The terms Harold and I agreed to were favorable. The interest rate is below market, and the repayment schedule is structured to avoid forcing any asset sales as long as payments are current. I looked at her steadily. They are current. Nothing is in jeopardy as long as that continues. Why? Vanessa said, and her voice had a new edge to it now. Something that was trying to be anger but kept bumping into confusion. Would Harold give you that kind of arrangement? Why wouldn't he go to a bank? Why wouldn't he tell us? He did go to a bank, I said. The bank was going to foreclose? I bought the debt before they could move. Harold told me not to tell anyone because he wanted the family to have time to stabilize before they knew the full picture. I paused. He also knew how you'd react. How we'd react? She laughed, but it was hollow. We're reacting to finding out that you've been holding the roof over your family's head, I said. I didn't say it with heat. I said it the way you state a fact in a meeting, evenly and clearly. For 2 years? Yes. There is a specific kind of silence that happens when the architecture of a room changes. When the person everyone has been looking down on is revealed to be the person who built the floor they're standing on. I had imagined this moment before, not with satisfaction, exactly, more with a kind of tired clarity. I had known it would come eventually. Harold had known too. He told me in one of our last conversations. When they find out, Maya, don't apologize. Don't soften it. Just let them feel it. Vanessa stood up. I don't think she knew she was going to. It seemed involuntary, like a reaction. This is manipulation, she said. You did this deliberately. You swooped in when the estate was vulnerable and you positioned yourself so that I saved it, I said. You leveraged it. I saved it and then structured a leverage position. Yes. That is my job. That is what Harold asked me to do. That is what I did. I kept my voice level. The alternative was First Meridian for closing on the estate within 18 months of Harold's passing. You would have been selling this house to cover the debt. You should have told us. Harold chose not to. I respected that. He was sick. He wasn't thinking clearly. He was the sharpest person in this family until the week before he died, I said, and this time there was something in my voice, not anger, but finality, and you know that. Vanessa sat back down, not gracefully. She sat down because her legs made the decision before her pride did. My Aunt Patricia had not said anything for several minutes. She was looking at her hands on the table. When she looked up at me, her expression was something I hadn't seen from her in 32 years. It wasn't warmth exactly. It was something closer to recognition. What are the terms? She asked. For the ongoing repayment. They're in Section 6, I said. Gerald can walk you through them. They're fair. Harold made sure of that. He didn't want this to be punitive. He wanted the estate to survive. I looked at her. So did I. Carter had been quiet for so long that when he spoke, half the table startled. Why? He said. Why did you care about saving it? He seemed to realize mid-sentence that he was about to say something that would confirm everything. It's not like you were the primary beneficiary of anything here. I looked at him for a moment. Because Harold asked me to, I said, and because despite everything, this is my family, even when it doesn't act like one. The room was very quiet. I thought about the $40,000 I'd sent to my father. The taped-up window on my car, the instant noodles I'd eaten for dinner 3 nights running, one February, while the firm was barely standing, because I had wired everything I had to people who needed it more than I did at that moment. I thought about every family dinner where I'd smiled at Vanessa's jokes and driven home in the dark and told myself it didn't matter. It had mattered. I just hadn't let it change what I did. That's the thing they don't tell you about being the one who holds things together quietly. It costs something. It costs something real and specific, and it comes out of your account, not theirs. And they don't know, and sometimes you let them not know, because the alternative, making them understand the arithmetic, feels like a different kind of loss. But there are moments when the ledger has to be opened. Not for revenge. For clarity. For the record to be accurate, even if just once. Even if only in a room where the grandfather clock is ticking, and the man you built this for isn't there to see it. Gerald finished reading. He answered questions from my aunt's attorney, who had been brought in as a courtesy, but had nothing substantive to contribute given that the documents were airtight. Vanessa did not speak again for the remainder of the meeting. Carter looked at his wine glass for a long time before setting it down untouched. As the room began to move toward its close, Vanessa's mother, my Aunt Patricia, stood up and walked to my end of the table. I watched her come. I didn't know what she was going to say. She stopped beside my chair and looked down at me, and for a moment I thought she was going to say something gracious, something that would rewrite the past 4 hours into something I could hold on to. She said, "You should have told us sooner." I nodded slowly. Maybe. She walked back to her end of the table. It was not an apology, it was the closest she could get. I understood. I have always been fluent in the language of people who cannot quite bring themselves to say the true thing. I gathered my things. Gerald caught my eye as I stood and gave me a small nod. The nod of a man who had been in enough of these rooms to recognize when the right person had finally said the right thing. I walked to the front door. I was almost through it when I heard Vanessa's voice behind me, and I stopped. She didn't say anything about the kids' table comment. She didn't say anything about the dress. She said quietly, "How long have you been running the firm?" 6 years, I said without turning around. A pause. I didn't know. I know you didn't, I said. I walked out to the cracked dashboard car, started it on the second try, and drove 4 hours home in the dark with the windows down. The air conditioning was working, but I didn't use it. I didn't need it. I had a call at 9 the next morning. A hotel in Savannah, 17 stories, carrying $4 million in delinquent debt, beautiful bones, terrible balance sheet. Exactly my kind of problem. I poured myself a coffee from the thermos I'd packed, and I thought about my Uncle Harold, and the last thing he'd said to me when we finished the restructuring agreement, and I told him I hoped it was enough. It's always enough, he'd said, when the right person is holding the deed. I merged onto the interstate. The road ahead was dark and long and entirely mine. If this story stayed with you, you know what to do. Like and subscribe to Aura Shine and drop a comment telling me what part hit you hardest. I read every single one.